Whether you're just getting started with urban sketching or you're looking to improve your drawings of houses, buildings, and little shop facades, this tutorial is for you. Hey everyone, and welcome to another one of my weekly art videos. I hope you're having an amazing day wherever you are in the world, and thanks so much for joining me on this one. In today's tutorial, I'm taking you through my entire drawing process for this pen and ink house scene. I share everything starting with how I create my preliminary sketch in pencil, stemming loosely from a reference photo, and as I do that, I share must-know information on 3D form and perspective, and I even share how I change certain parts of the house while maintaining believable form and perspective, which is essential for believable results. Once that preliminary sketch looks good, I move on to sharing all of my favorite pen and ink techniques that I use to add detail, to add texture, to add some shading, and my process as a whole, which always helps me arrive at better results. All right, with all that said, let's jump in. Before jumping into the good stuff, I just want to briefly talk about the supplies that I'm going to be bringing into this drawing process. I'm going to be working in a 9 by 12 inch regular drawing sketchbook, and this is from Canson. I'm going to be using an HB drawing pencil for the graphite process, and this pencil is going to help me keep everything nice and light. I have 2 erasers on hand. One of them is a soft graphite eraser and the other one is a kneaded eraser. And for my pen and ink process, I'll be using a Unipin fine liner, and this is from Mitsubishi Pencil Co. and the tip is 0.1 in size. And with that, let's jump in. Before putting pencil to paper, I always take a moment to observe that reference photo or whatever it is that I have in front of me in real life. It is incredibly important that I understand what kind of perspective is going on so that I can properly recreate those 3D forms and structures and recreate that believable sense of perspective in my drawing. In this case, we have 2-point perspective. And 2-point perspective is more challenging than 1-point perspective. And if you're just getting started with drawing houses and buildings or with perspective in general, I would highly recommend checking out a video that I shared a while back that I believe I titled Understanding 1 and 2-Point Perspective or something like that, in which I walk you through step-by-step exercises using the 1 and the 2-point perspective grids. And I show you how to draw rectangular prisms or boxes using 1 and 2-point perspective. That is so important that you understand if you want to get to a point at which you're able to draw buildings and houses freehand. And I have another house drawing tutorial for beginners in which I take you through the same process that I'm going to be taking you through today, but it is a lot simpler because that is an elevation view of a house. Elevation view drawings are way easier than 2-point perspective or 3-point perspective drawings of buildings and houses, because when it comes to an elevation view drawing or sketch of a house, it's just a flat forward-facing view in which you're just seeing one flat front face of that box or that structure. And the house is relatively at eye level, so it's like you're standing directly in front of that front wall right in the middle of the house. So you can't really see other planes except for that front one. And when it comes to something like this, like we're drawing today, this is 2-point perspective because we're closest to a corner of this house, of this building, and we see 2 planes receding away from us. And when it comes to drawing something with 2-point or 3-point perspective, this entails having a greater understanding of both form and perspective. So check out those 2 other tutorials that I shared a while back because those are perfect for anyone that's just getting started. I'll make sure to link to those down below in the text section of this post. And if you're a little bit more advanced, then absolutely go ahead and continue on with this tutorial. All right, so as I said, this is 2-point perspective. So there are 2 vanishing points on either side of this house, to the left and to the right, and these vanishing points are way far off the picture plane. You can see these white lines that I have added over the photo, and these are converging lines that would meet at these vanishing points. And these converging lines are essential to visualize as we are creating our sketch. The bottom edges of this house, the windows, the doors, etc. To draw all of those shapes effectively and to keep the perspective consistent throughout the image, we need to visualize these converging lines that would meet at these vanishing points. Whenever you're going to be drawing a house or a building, observe those straight lines present throughout that structure. Observe the bottom edges where the building meets the ground, the edges of those rectangular or squared shapes in the windows and the doors. All of those would be horizontal lines that would look straight and horizontal in front of your eyes if you were right in front of the house, meaning the top and bottom edges of all of these shapes, they turn into diagonals or lines that would converge at those vanishing points. So never stop visualizing those vanishing points as you're drawing all of these elements. So that's what I wanted to mention when it comes to perspective. I like to visualize houses and buildings like boxes. Boxes made up of different planes. And sometimes those boxes are going to be simpler and other times they're going to be what we call compound structures or compound forms, which simply means that it's a combination of two or more structures that are brought together. So you can visualize that bottom boxy structure of the house as one simple form, and then the top kind of triangular part or roof of the house as a separate triangular prism that is added or stacked over that rectangular prism. However, this particular house is even more complex than this because it has another smaller separate section that has been added to this. And that smaller separate section is also made up of that base rectangular prism boxy structure with another triangular prism stacked over that. And then we have an even smaller structure that is added to this, which is the chimney. So here are the two planes that we're able to see of this rectangular prism, which is more long and narrow, which is the chimney pointed out here. I know that chimneys can be tricky to draw, so I wanted to make sure to point this out. We see two planes of this chimney, which is a separate structure or box that is connected to the roof, which is that triangular prism. If you're able to understand all of this and you're able to recreate these general most important structures on your paper, then everything else is going to be super easy, because to add in the doors and the windows and all that, it's just following those diagonals, those converging lines, and visualizing those. So I'm going to move forward, but if you ever get stuck at any point, come back to this part of the video and see these separate shapes that I have pointed out for you here. Okay, so with all that said, remember those 3 rules that I always go by whenever I'm drawing pretty much anything. Number 1, work from general towards specific. Number 2, draw lightly in the beginning so that you can refine your drawing and erase mistakes. And number 3, visualize everything as simple shapes and forms. Ignore all of the little plants and flowers and everything that is covering up the house. Try to just tune them out in the beginning, because what's most important is getting that major structure of the house down and focusing on arriving at effective form and perspective. Okay, so I like starting with the 5 vertical lines that I'm able to see of this house from this vantage point or this place where I am standing. Notice all of the verticals present there. We see one for the left edge of the house, then one for that corner of the house that is nearest us, one for the right plane of the house, and then we have that other smaller structure that is coming out, which also creates at least a couple of other vertical lines. Right here, you're gonna see me do some erasing and correcting. I wanna make sure that the space between these vertical lines makes sense before I move forward. So what I mean by this is I am trying to notice the distance between these vertical lines created by all of these edges of these structures, or where the planes meet so that I can get the proportions of this house relatively similar in my drawing to what I'm observing in that photo. At least when it comes to the width of these planes. I'm not really concerning myself with the height of these planes yet. I make longer lines than what I'm actually going to be needing, and later on I'm just going to erase out those sections of those lines that I don't need anymore. Once those vertical lines are in, it is time to get started with the diagonals. And the diagonals that I want to add in are the top and bottom edges of the base rectangular prism, which is that bottom base box making up the structure of this house. So I'm not concerning myself right now with the triangular prism that is going to be stacked over this rectangular prism. I'm just focusing on getting in that base structure. And as I am drawing those diagonals, I'm observing the photo closely and I'm trying to notice those angles. Where would this base bottom box end? And where does that triangular prism start that is stacked over this box? Pinpoint those sections of straight lines that you are able to see in that reference photo. And then just complete those sections that you're not able to see because perhaps they are covered by other elements on the ground or whatever the case may be. But try to notice those straight lines and try to recreate those angles to the best of your abilities. Even the rows of bricks have lines that they create. And if you're having trouble with this, a little exercise that I would recommend doing is printing out different house photos and then taking a Sharpie and drawing a line over those straight lines that you are able to see in that image, whether those straight lines are created by edges of windows or the bottom edge of the house, which is coming into contact with the ground, doors, or even design elements throughout the house. All of those are going to create straight lines. This practice is going to get you into the habit of observing and pinpointing those straight lines, and it's going to help you visualize where those vanishing points or vanishing point would be. Once those bottom base boxy structures are in, it is time to get started with the top triangular prisms. And for this, I am once again noticing the angles created by those intersecting triangular prisms that are meeting at the back. You probably noticed that I started by placing a little tiny tick mark at the top little point of that triangular section. I did this before continuing to build out the triangular prism. I like doing this in order to visualize how tall that triangular prism is going to be. Houses with triangular roof portions sometimes have taller triangular prisms and others have shorter triangular prisms. And this one is kind of tall. From there, I just did my best to recreate those angles of those lines present in that reference photo to the best of my abilities to close these different planes for the triangular prism. And because this is not one point perspective, the top point or peak of these triangles is not exactly in the middle of that front plane. It's slightly off center. And once I have those basic shapes in, making up those triangular prisms for those roofs, I then move on to making refinements. I compare my drawing with the reference photo and I want to make sure that everything makes sense. If I need to improve angles, if I need to improve proportions, I go ahead and do all of that. I also go ahead and erase lines that I don't need anymore. Right here, I notice that I have a lot of empty space at the bottom, and even though I do want to make sure to leave some space for a little path and plants that I'm going to be adding at the bottom, there's just a lot of empty space, and I can definitely utilize that drawing space a lot more effectively by making the house a little bit taller. And I think that this change would also make the proportions of this house a little bit more similar to what I'm observing in the photo. It just looks a little bit too short or small for me in my drawing. So all I did was I recreated those same lines that I had along the bottom edge, recreated those angles, but just brought them down a little bit, made those initial verticals a little bit longer, and recreated those same lines and the same angles that I had, just a little bit lower, maybe half an inch below what I initially had. And here I'm making the roof a little bit longer as well. I'm just comparing and contrasting my sketch with that reference photo over and over and over again in order to make sure that this largest structure looks good to me before moving forward. Once everything looks good to me, I then start adding the front planes of the roof sections. At this point, I just had shapes making up the roof. And those shapes are flat and two-dimensional. I had to turn them into 3D forms. How do you turn a flat two-dimensional shape into a 3D form? Well, you need to add those other planes, those other sides making up that structure. So what I'm doing is I'm observing that reference photo and I'm noticing those other planes that I'm able to see for the roof portion of both of these structures, the larger one and the smaller one on the right. I'm noticing how large those shapes for those planes are in relation to what I already have in my drawing so that I can get proportions relatively similar to that house in the photo. When it comes to the roofs, you can see that interior or underneath plane a little bit as well. From this vantage point that we're standing in, you can see a little bit of that interior of that roof on the left and on the right. And I made sure to make those happen because those are important sections to add in if I'm looking for this to look believable. From there, I moved on to adding the chimney. And because this is two-point perspective, we're also able to see those two planes of the chimney structure, the left plane and the right plane. And I did change a little bit of that chimney design as well. I made the top section separate and a little bit tapered. To create that tapered look, simply change that straight vertical line on the three edges of that rectangular prism and turn them into diagonals or slanted lines. And you can change the angle depending on how much tapering you want. After adding in the chimney, it was time to start adding in the windows and also the door. If you notice in the photo, the design of this house, in between the rows of those bricks, you'll see a couple of long lines, which would be long, straight, horizontal lines if we were standing directly in front of one of these planes making up this house. These long, straight lines are very helpful to add in because they kind of symbolize the separation between the first floor and the second floor of the house. And this is important whenever you're going to be drawing doors and windows. I mean, we have to know if the windows or doors that we're adding in belong to the first floor or the second floor of the house. And also, there is some amount of alignment when it comes to the windows in a house. So that's why I added in those longer lines to help me separate out the floors. This made it easier to visualize where to place the windows and also the door later on. But you're also going to see me use long vertical lines to help me keep the windows aligned with each other. And there are two things that I changed quite a bit. One of them is this window portion that is coming out to the left here. Remember, whenever you're adding in any of these secondary smaller structures and you're connecting them to that larger structure of the house, just think of these as smaller boxes that you are connecting to that larger box, and continue using those converging lines that would meet at the vanishing points when you're drawing those planes. Of course, when it comes to tapered designs, for example, the diagonals in the roofs and also the diagonals in that top part of the chimney and this top little roof section above the window, those are not converging lines that would meet at the vanishing point. Those are separate diagonals. Remember that the lines that converge at the vanishing points would be lines that look straight and horizontal if you were to stand right in front of that window, of that door, of that wall, whatever it is, and not lines that would look like diagonal lines if you were standing in front of them. The little roof section above this window that is coming out in the house in the photo is quite different from what I am drawing here. In the photo, that little roof section is kind of just a straight thing going out, and I created more of a 3D trapezoid looking section, very similar to that tapered top section that I added to the chimney. And I'm also going to be adding a door and a kind of front entrance instead of a window on this right plane. The first thing that I did was I created that flat door shape. I made sure that the door itself was a believable height and that it was in the location that I wanted the door to be. Once that shape was in, I started building out that little roof entrance that I wanted in front of the door. This is another structure that entails bringing in diagonals that do not converge at those vanishing points, because this is again a structure that actually has diagonals to it, like awnings. So I drew that little roof portion in a size that seemed appropriate over that door shape. And once those two planes for that little awning or roof were in, I brought down verticals to help me convey those little pillars or posts to support that awning. And then I wanted two little walls on either side. And those are going to be shorter brick walls. As I am adding all of these things from imagination, I'm continuing to visualize those vanishing points on either side, and I'm continuing to take breaks to see everything as a whole. I need to make sure that the sense of perspective is consistent all throughout the piece. The window shapes are easier to add in after I have deciphered what's the first floor and what's the second floor. You can see how I added in those long vertical lines, especially for the windows on the right to keep them aligned. And once all of those smaller shapes and elements were in the house, I added in the path in front of the house with a couple of straight lines. And from there, I started adding in organic elements, plants that I wanted to add in front of the house. In a little bit, I'm going to be adding some trees. And I forgot that I wanted to add in that, I think it's like a little porch or something on the opposite side of the house. And this I took from that reference photo. I thought it would be a very nice section to add in because it would add depth and complexity to the house, having that little back section peeping out there. And then I continued with the organic elements, the trees, the plants, etc. I have an entire video where I explain my process for drawing trees. I created that video because I know that drawing trees can definitely be challenging. It took me a while to actually like how my trees looked and to draw them in a believable way. I'll make sure to link to that video down below in the text section of this post in case you'd like to go and check it out. But when it comes to drawing anything organic, whether it's plants, trees, flowers, or even fruits and vegetables, you want to make sure that there is a symmetry, irregularity, and imperfection involved when you're drawing them or painting them, and not looking stiff or patterny. When it comes to drawing trees specifically, I like making sure that the tree trunk is tapered, wider at the bottom and more narrow as it goes up. And then I also want to make sure that the branches are tapered and more tapered or thinner and pointier as they make their way away from the tree trunk. Right here, I'm just doing a little bit of lightening and cleaning up with my kneaded eraser before adding my smaller details. I'm definitely going to be leaving some detail out. I am not going to be adding all of the textures and details in pencil. I'm going to be doing that with my pen and ink right away without having drawn anything with pencil first. And how much you do with your graphite pencil before switching to the pen and ink is completely up to you. And also it depends on the amount of practice that you have with the subject on hand. There is no right or wrong. This is not cheating, so don't think of it that way either. What's important here is that you practice whatever you need to practice before moving to the more permanent medium. Plan whatever techniques it is that you're thinking of bringing in with the pen and ink so that you don't go in blindly. So for example, even at this point, I'm already thinking of the specific mark making techniques that I'm going to be using with my pen later on to help me describe the brick texture, the roof texture, the texture of wood in those trees, etc. Set yourself up for success so that you can arrive at a better outcome, at better results. And what you have to do in order to get there is really going to depend on where you're at in your journey. So the creative process is going to look different for all of us. Some people would be okay with just creating those largest basic shapes and they can jump straight into the pen and ink, while others may decide to add in much more detail with pencil before jumping into the pen and ink. But whatever you're comfortable with is perfectly okay, because do remember that pen and ink is permanent and you're not going to be able to erase or fix those mistakes that you do with pen. For me, things like bricks and textures that I'm going to be adding to the roof and details that I'm going to be adding to the plants and stuff like that, I just go in and do them with pen and ink. And I'm all done with my pencil drawing. I'm just going to clean up my drawing one last time before switching to my pen and ink. And it is time to move on to the pen and ink drawing process. The first thing that I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be tracing over all of the edges of my largest shapes. And before getting started with any new shape, I make sure to look at what it is that I'm drawing so that I can avoid tracing over sections of lines that shouldn't be visible. And what I mean by this is I don't want to trace over sections of lines where there is overlapping taking place or there is an element that is partially covering up that thing, that wall, that window, whatever it is behind it. And so I really wouldn't be able to see that part of that line or shape because there is something in front of that that is covering it up. I don't want to trace over those lines. This is something that I accidentally did time and time again in the past when working with pen and ink. And then because pen and ink is permanent, you're not going to be able to erase that. So be careful when you're doing your tracing over your graphite. Because I am right-handed, it is easier for me to make my way from left to right. However, you can do the inverse of this if you are left-handed. I've never had any issues with this pen or with Micron pens or with my pigment liners from Staedtler when it comes to smudging and things like that. I find the ink in these pens dries pretty fast. This said, I do stay mindful of where I was last working in so that I can avoid resting my entire hand over that area when the ink is fresh as I continue moving on with my drawing process. Something else that you can do if you're worried about smudging is placing a piece of tracing paper under your hand as you're moving forward with your tracing. Another thing that I make sure to do is I make sure to keep my arm and my hand moving. I don't stay in one area or element for too long. I'm not working incredibly fast, but I make sure to keep my arm moving. This helps me avoid stop and start marks within these lines that I'm creating, and also very stiff and heavy looking lines. If you find that you're having trouble tracing over those long straight lines, something that I would recommend is simply tackling that tracing in sections. You don't necessarily have to create a long continuous line from start to finish. You can tackle those longer lines in sections, and most likely shorter lines will be easier for you. By keeping things moving and keeping things flowing, you'll also more easily arrive at line weight variation throughout your drawing. And line weight variation is something that I've talked about in depth in other pen and ink videos. Line weight variation is so important when drawing with any medium, but especially when it comes to pen and ink. And all this term refers to is simply making sure that there is a variation in thickness and darkness in your line work. Think of coloring book pages or even cartoons. In that type of art, there is usually a consistent, thick, bold, even black outline around all of the elements making up that image. And these thick, bold, black outlines really flatten everything out. And in order to avoid this flat look, We want to make certain sections of our lines and marks thinner and lighter, and other sections of our lines and marks thicker and darker. And this is going to lead to a more dynamic, interesting look at the end. By working swiftly and by experimenting with different angles that you're holding your pen at, and even varying the pressure that you're exerting, as well as maybe even exploring bringing in a larger pen tip size or something like that for certain elements or sections that you want to make pop out to the viewer. Things like that can really add interest and depth to your drawings, instead of having one consistent line weight all throughout. Embrace little imperfections and wobbles that happen along the way. Your lines don't have to be perfect, and small irregularities and imperfections actually add personality and interest to your final results. So stay mindful and focused as you're doing all of your tracing and your pen and ink work, but there's no need to be a perfectionist about it. I'd say it's better for your lines to look dynamic and have little imperfections than to end up with lines that look perfect but super stiff. I'm continuing to do my tracing over all of my pencil work, so I'm not adding anything new to my drawing just yet. I want to take care of all of these edges and I guess medium and smaller sized shapes before moving on to textures and even smaller shapes and details. You can see how, for example, the detail that I've added into the windows is just me replicating those larger shapes that I created and making a larger one around that shape that I've created, or making a smaller shape inside of that, just using the angles and the lines that I've already laid down for myself. Because you took your time with that initial base drawing that you created, making sure that form and perspective and proportions, all of that looks good, then all of the smaller shapes should be easier to draw because you're using all of those shapes and lines that you've already created as a kind of guide. You can trust that the lines and the shapes that you've already created look good and perspective is sound. So you can let go more and more as you move into the smaller shapes and details. Once I finished with tracing over those more geometric angular shapes, I'm now moving on to the organic elements, the plants, the trees. And for all of these organic elements, I make sure that my arm, my hand, my wrist are nice and loose. If I'm overly controlling of these lines and marks, then those organic elements may look too stiff, and I don't want that. You can see how in those plants in front of the house, I've already started adding in some texture marks inside of those very loosely in a very expressive way. I thought of a type of mark that could help me convey the direction of the growth of the branches and leaves in these plants. And that's what I went with. I ended up with these marks that look like a type of fan. And then I started in with the trees. You can see how I also started adding in some marks inside of those tree trunks to help me describe a little bit of that wood texture. And for the leaf portion, I am making sure that those shapes that I create are very asymmetrical and irregular along the edges. I'm all done with tracing over my pencil work and even adding in a little bit of more detail in those organic elements. And here I just took a quick second to erase out all of my graphite work before moving forward. This is the point where I finally get started with all those new details that I'm going to be adding into the house, as well as those texture marks. So what I like doing is I like observing the texture in that reference, or if it's going to be a new texture that I'm going to be adding in from imagination, I really like taking time to think about the specific lines and marks that I can create that will help me describe or convey that specific texture. It's very important that you don't go in randomly with just any line or mark, because you may end up creating a texture that you didn't want. And there is nothing, in my opinion, better that you can do than to explore different mark making and even shading techniques when it comes to working with pen and ink, because this will help open your horizons and give you ideas or tools that you can pull out of your tool bag when you're actually creating a full picture. So you can see how I'm starting with the texture and the roof of the house, and I'm just using more kind of lateral or horizontal, relatively short marks that I feel will help me describe the shingles or tiles in the roof. Even as I am creating those lines and marks, I have the converging lines in mind. Once I'm done with that texture, I move on to adding the bricks throughout the walls of the house. Now, as I'm creating all of these different textures, really notice how loosely I'm going in, and notice the irregularity that I am making sure to create. I am staying away from the look of patterns and any type of organization when it comes to creating these lines and shapes and marks. Even when it comes to the bricks, I'm not going in and creating a little rectangle. I'm more so going in and creating lines and marks. Most of these are not even closed shapes. I'm making sure to cluster these bricks together in different ways, and it is not necessary to fill everything in order to convey that brick texture. I would say that the texture in the roof and also the brick texture in the walls, those two are the main textures that I wanted to tackle first. After that, I kind of jumped around and started adding a smaller detail. For example, right there, I added more lines on top of the lines that I already had there, and that in and of itself provides more interest and detail to the house. And I also added in straight lines to convey a little bit of the texture in the roof sections above the window on the left and also above the door. From there, I just jumped around the entire piece and I continued seeing everything as a whole, asking myself where I wanted to add more detail and texture, and making sure that I was having the focal point, which is the house, in mind, so that I can add more detail, more texture, and more contrast to the house than to the other elements around it, so that the house can really pop out to the viewer, because this is the focal point. I added more little clusters of little teardrop shapes here and there throughout the plants, more little branches using upwards flicking motions. And what you're seeing me do right now is I'm finally going in with alternative shading techniques. The main two alternative shading techniques that I brought into this piece are hatching and cross hatching. All hatching is simply laying down sets or groups of straight parallel lines. And these lines can go off in any direction or can have any angle that you choose. But once you choose an angle, try to keep that consistent throughout that section that you are shading in. When we're using alternative shading techniques, we're basically developing darker values by covering up more of that whiteness of that paper via lines or marks. If we cover up more paper, it's a darker value, and if we cover up less paper, it's a lighter value. To do cross-hatching, all you have to do is lay down a second group of straight parallel lines over that first group, and when you're choosing an angle for that second group that you're going to be overlapping over that first one, you can choose any angle for that second group of lines as long as they end up intersecting or crossing over those first lines. And by doing cross-hatching, you're covering up more paper, which is going to lead to a darker value. So perhaps consider using cross-hatching in darkest dark areas and hatching in lighter shadow areas or mid-tone areas. You can see how I thought of which areas would have shadow in them. So under roof portions, inside of windows, planes that are facing away from the light, whether you chose the light source to be on the upper left, upper right, or whatever the case may be. The planes facing away from the light would be darker than the planes facing toward the light. And just wherever there is a voluminous structure that is impeding or keeping that light from hitting parts of the structure underneath it or next to it, All of those areas are areas where you can add a little bit of shading. And I'm even going to be adding some hatching and cross hatching into some plants where there would be shadow, where the house is creating a shadow on that plant, or where clusters of leaves are creating shadows on leaves behind them. This is a great exercise because it gets you into the habit of thinking of light behavior, which helps you add depth and realism even to pieces that you're creating from imagination. All right, so I'm all done with the most essential detail, shading, texture that I wanted to make sure to do. At this point, I am just jumping around the entire piece and seeing everything as a whole. Really notice how I am using the lines, the shapes that I already have, and sometimes adding more detail is simply recreating that shape once again in a smaller way inside of that larger shape that I already have, or recreating that shape in a slightly larger way outside of that shape, recreating lines to the left or to the right or above or below the ones that I already have. And that really helps add a little bit more detail, a little bit more definition, and greater contrast. But again, I am making sure that there is more detail added to the focal point, which is the house. If I add too much detail and too much definition and contrast to the elements in the environment around the house, I know that the house won't pop out to the viewer as much. It's all about creating a heavier visual weight in the house or in whatever focal point it is that you choose, and a lesser visual weight in the elements that are secondary or tertiary. Thinking about composition is so essential, and it'll definitely help take your art to the next level if it's not something you're currently doing. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I am offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited, they are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops, all have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love, love, love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.